Have you ever tried solving a Rubik's Cube? Back in 1974, when this little object was invented, it was considered almost impossible to solve. And indeed, if you don't understand how it works, you can just twist it for a lifetime without getting any closer to the solution. Around the same time, humanity discovered another puzzle, far bigger and far more dangerous. In 1972, a team of scientists published The Limits to Growth. It was the first attempt to model the long-term sustainability of our global economy. Their finding was as simple as it was shocking. As the economy grows, it consumes more resources and produces more pollution. Since the biosphere is finite, an exponentially growing economy will eventually run into resource scarcity, ecosystem collapse, or both. 50 years later, that problem is still staring right back at us. 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. Climate change, biodiversity breakdown, chemical pollution, nutrient pollution, soil conversion, freshwater disruption. That study stops in 2022, but we crossed ocean acidification after that. Our global footprint exceeds what the planet can sustain by nearly 100%. This is like putting 2 tons of weight in an elevator that can only safely carry 1 ton. It's reckless. And when I say our global footprint, take it with a pinch of salt, since the 38 richest nations, home to only 15% of humanity, drive nearly half of that ecological damage. We went from 75% too much in the year 2000 to 96% too much 20 years later. This is a transition from disaster to catastrophe. Finding a way for these high footprint, high income countries to get back within planetary boundaries, that's the greatest puzzle that ever was. And until now, we were told that the solution to that puzzle is simple. Introduce the right tax. Invest in clean technology. Let innovation do the magic. Growth, we were told, would go from dirty to green. If that story seems too good to be true, that's because it is. Evidence shows that there is no country on Earth that has managed to shrink its total ecological footprint while growing its economy. A few nations have managed to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions, even though most of the time it's only for certain sectors, it's only for a few years, and then it almost never takes into account imported emissions. But taking this into account, let's look at the best of the best of the best of the best. Let me introduce you the 11 nations in the world that have managed to reduce their consumption-based emissions while growing GDP. But the problem here is speed. At this current pace, it would take these nations more than 2 centuries to achieve neutral carbon neutrality. That's like the crew of the Titanic promising to turn next time they see an iceberg. That's too little, too late. What we need instead looks like this: an urgent, massive, and historically unprecedented drop. And that's only for climate change, which is one problem out of the 6 or 7 planetary boundaries we need to fix. That's why I like to visualize this as a giant Rubik's Cube. Not just global warming, but 6 interdependent ecological crises. Not just stabilizing footprints, but making them much lighter. Not in 200 years, but in the next decades. Now that we have this in mind, we can start realizing that that's a very difficult puzzle. And we need to face the fact that the current strategy to solve it has failed. Our mistake was thinking that efficiency alone was powerful enough to make an economy sustainable. But it cannot. And I think we have 50 years of evidence as proof. I'm not saying here that we don't need technological progress. Of course we do. But that's only one part of the solution, and a smaller part than we think. To understand why, let's do some ecological macroeconomics. There are 3 main ways of reducing an economy's footprint. You can do less, you can do different, and you can do better. You can reduce the scale of an economy, producing and consuming less. You can change its composition, shifting from certain goods and services to others. And then you can improve its efficiency, finding more advanced technologies and modes of organization. The order between these steps matters. We need to start with scale. Why? Because the most renewable resource is the one we don't need. Before rushing, finding the shiniest, newest, greenest way of building a new shopping mall, let's ask ourselves, do we need a shopping mall? If we don't, then let's not build it. Problem solved. That mentality goes by many names. Minimalism, exnovation, degrowth. It's not about sacrifice, it's about sufficiency. Trimming the unnecessary so that we can preserve resources for what truly matters. Simplifying needs make everything downstream easier. It's easier to electrify a small, shrinking fleet of cars than a massive growing fleet of cars. It's easier to recycle batches of phones when they're replaced every 1 year, 5 years, than when they're replaced every 10 years or every year. We realize here that it's a bit like in the movie Minority Report, where crimes are solved before they happen. Minimalism can prevent environmental harms before it even begins. But you cannot avoid everything. And so once you've done scaled as much as you can shift to composition. Once you've minimized the square meters you build, the kilometers you travel, the calories you eat, the kilowatts you use, you can ask yourself, what is the most sustainable way of meeting those needs? For food, it might mean transitioning from meat-based to plant-based diets. For mobility, shifting from air to rail, from car to buses, from buses to bikes. For energy, it means phasing out fossil fuels and replacing them with renewable energies. I'm not saying here that we need to stop eating, moving, producing, building, no. But we need to find the most environmentally adequate way of doing so. Once we've done as much scale, downscaling, minimalism as we can, then doing as much shifting as we can move to the third step, efficiency. But let's be careful here. Efficiency is not about cutting costs to boost profits. It's not about greening GDP. It's not about being more competitive. Efficiency means extracting as much well-being from the least amount of natural resources. It can be technical, replacing a heavy fossil fuel cars by a smaller electric one, or swapping an oil furnace by a heat pump, but it can also be social. Sharing things instead of owning them. Designing housing that is collective instead of isolated. Innovation is not only machines, it's in organization, in culture, in politics. And we need all of that together. Complex problems require complex solutions. So no, alone a carbon tax won't stop global warming. No, turning vegan is not enough to make our food system sustainable. And no, cheaper solar panels are not going to make our economy sustainable. But when we align the three logics of less, different, and better, we move from isolated gestures to a systemic plan. Sufficiency gives us direction. Adequacy shapes the path. Efficiency gives us speed. Each step unlocks the next, and the whole process can repeat. Layer by layer, step by step, we can twist our way back within planetary boundaries. So, let's solve the Rubik's Cube of sustainability. Let's do less, limiting advertising, blocking the construction of new airport and highway, criminalizing planned obsolescence, divesting from fossil fuels. Let's do different, supporting the transition to agroecology, making public transport free, introducing local currencies. Let's do better, replacing GDP with well-being indicators, launching tool libraries and repair cafes, better environmental education, a more participatory democracy, and most importantly, already sharing the wealth we have more equitably. Each action is a twist of the cube. Each bring one more facet into alignment. And together, they form the pattern of a world returning to balance. The planetary crisis we face is the greatest puzzle humanity ever encountered. For decades, techno-optimists told us to wait for that one single gadget that would magically solve all of our problems. But that's a lazy, comforting fairy tale. And like all fairy tale, it keeps us asleep. It keeps us passive. It keeps us locked in the waiting room of the transition. The truth is humbler and more empowering. When we stop waiting for a miracle and start decomposing the big problem into small, solvable ones, we realize that we already hold the keys to all the solutions we need. So, what are we waiting for? We have a Rubik's Cube to solve.